I would first like to thank the Regents Lecture Committee and the Department of French, and of course my friend Léo Bersani. And I would like to tell my friends in Berkeley how glad I feel to be back among them. In a dialogue written at the end of the 2nd century after death, Lucian presents us a certain Hermotimus, who walks mumbling in the street. One of his friends, Licinius, sees him, crosses the street, and asks him, "What are you mumbling about?" And the answer comes, "I am trying to remember what I have to tell to my master." And through the conversation between those two, Hermotimus and Licinius, we learn that Hermotimus has been visiting his master for 20 years, that he is nearly ruined by the very high cost of those precious lessons, and we learned that Hermotimus may need 20 years more to arrive at the end of his training. But we learn also what those lessons are about. Hermotimus is taught by his master how to take care of himself in the best possible way. I am sure that none of you is a modern Hermotimus, but I hold the bet that most of you have met at least one of those guys who nowadays regularly visit a kind of master who takes their money from them in order to teach them how to take care of themselves. But fortunately enough, I have forgotten, either in French or in English or in German, the name of those modern masters. In antiquity, they were called philosophers. In order to explain why I am interested in the theme of the culture of the self as a philosophical and as an historical question, I'd like to take as a point of departure a short text written by Kant in 1784. The text is Was ist Aufklärung? Enlightenment. This text was an answer to a question published by the Berlinische Monatsschrift, and at this same question, Moses Mendelssohn gave also his own answer, which was published 2 months before Kant's answer. I think that a certain attention has to be paid to this text. First, it is worthwhile to underline that the German philosophical movement through Kant and the Jewish Haskalah through Moses Mendelssohn met at the same moment on the same topics. Was ist Aufklärung? It is also worthwhile to pay attention to this kind of philosophical interrogation about the present. Of course, I know that it is not the first time philosophers ask questions about their own present, about the historical or religious or philosophical meaning of the present. But most of the time, those interrogations deal either with a comparison between the present moment and a previous one, or those interrogations deal with the announcement of a future through some signs which have to be deciphered. Most of the time, the question about present is a question about decline or improvement, proximity of a new age, or arrival of the promised last days. In Kant's text, the question is put in terms of a very specific achievement in the general history of reason, or more precisely, in the general history of the way we use our reason. And this kind of interrogation is interesting on two grounds. First, the first reason is that the 18th century is very often credited with the universal conception of reason, and this assumption is correct. But the 18th century has been also aware of the historical changes in the use of reason, and the representation Kant gives of those historical changes is very different from a simple progress of development of reason. But I think that there is another justification for paying attention to the text written by Kant about enlightenment. This text, I think, has introduced, in the field of philosophical reflection, a new kind of question, the question of the nature, the meaning, the historical and philosophical signification of the which he is himself a part. I don't mean that previous philosophers were not aware of their own present and that they did not worry about it. Hobbes, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz took into account their own situation and the situation of the contemporary world, as Plato did or Augustine. But for Descartes, the failure of several so-called sciences, for Hobbes, the political situation of England, for Leibniz, the religious debates and quarrels, were reasons for them to intervene and try to change something in such a situation. I think that Kant's question about Aufklärung meant something else. At the same time, Kant gives a justification of his own philosophical task through analyzing the actuality which he belonged to, and he gives as a target to his philosophical work to play a certain role in the natural, in the spontaneous history of reason. In this short paper about enlightenment, Kant raises a set of questions which I think are characteristic for modern philosophy. And those questions are: what is our actuality as an historical figure? What are we? And what do we have to be as part of this actuality? Why is it necessary to philosophize, and why is it the specific, and what is the specific task of philosophy in relation to this actuality? I think that those questions did not remain embedded, buried in this rather obscure text, but that they took more and more importance in Western philosophy. When Fichte was concerned with this rather extraordinary event, it was not only that he felt he had a support, but what was the role of his own philosophy in this event. In a certain way, Hegel's philosophy is an attempt to answer this very simple question: what is the meaning of this day when so much as a result of the critique itself, but as a result of this critico-historical question: what are we now? I think that we can find in the field of philosophical activities since the beginning of the 19th century two poles which are related to each other and which cannot be reduced to each other. At one of these poles, you find such questions as: what is truth? How is it possible to know the truth? That is the pole of philosophy as formal ontology of truth or as critical analysis of knowledge. And at the other pole, you find such questions as what is our actuality? What are we as part of this actuality? What is the target of our activity of philosophizing insofar as we are part of our actuality? Those questions deal with what I should call the historical ontology of ourselves or the critical history of thought. It is in the framework of this second type of questions that I have undertook several historical inquiries about madness or medicine, crime and punishment, or about sexuality. Of course, there have been several ways, and there are still several ways for elaborating those questions about our historical ontology. But I think that any ontological history of ourselves have to analyze three sets of relations: our relations to truth, our relations to obligation, our relations to ourselves and to the others. Or, to turn it with other words, in order to answer the question, what are we now? We have to consider that we are thinking beings, since it is through thought that we are beings who look for truth, who accept or refuse obligations, laws, coercions, and who are related to ourselves or to the others. My aim is not to answer the general question, what is a thinking being? My aim is to answer the question, how did the history of our thought, I mean of our relation to truth, to obligations, to ourselves and to the others, make us what we are? In brief, how could we analyze the formation of ourselves through the history of our thought? And by thought, I do not mean exclusively philosophy, nor theoretical thinking, nor scientific knowledge. I don't want to analyze what people think opposed to what they do, but what they think, what they do when they are, what they think when they do what they are doing. What I want to analyze is the meaning they give to their own behavior, the way they integrate their behavior in general strategies, the type of rationality they recognize in their different practices, institutions, models, and behavior. When I was studying madness and psychiatry, crime and punishment, I have been led to emphasize the analysis of our relation first to truth and then to obligation. Studying now the constitution of our experience of sexuality, I have been more and more inclined to pay attention to the relation to oneself and to the techniques through which those relations have been shaped. In order to analyze these techniques of the self, I'd like to choose as a point of departure a notion which has been, I think, very important in the Greek and in the Roman culture. I'll try tonight to give you a very short draft of the problems linked to this notion, and maybe we could elaborate this first resume during the meetings and seminars we'll have together during the next weeks. This notion, which I have chosen as a point of departure, is what the Greeks called epimeleia heautou, and the Latins cura sui. It's not very easy to translate these terms, but I'll try. Epimeleia heautou is something like the concern with oneself, or, as we say in French, le souci de soi. The verbal form epimeleistai heautou means something like to be concerned with oneself, to take care of oneself, s'occuper de soi-même. the precept that one has to take care of oneself, to be concerned with oneself, precept that one has to epimeleistai eoto, was for the Greeks and the Romans one of the main principles of ethics, one of the main rules for their art of life, and this for almost 1,000 years. Let's have a look at some marking points in this very long period. First, Socrates himself. In the Apology written by Plato, we see Socrates presenting himself before his judges as the master of the concern with oneself. He addresses passers-by and tells them, "You concern yourselves with your riches, with your reputation, with your honors, but you do not concern yourself with your virtue or with your soul." And Socrates watches over his fellow citizens to make sure that they take care of themselves. He considers that this task has been conferred on him by the god, and he will not abandon it except with his last breath. Well, 8 centuries later, the same notion of concern with oneself, epimeleia heotu, the same notion appears with a role equally very important in a Christian author, Gregory of Nyssa. But it has, in Gregory of Nyssa, a very different meaning. By this term, Gregory of Nyssa means the movement by which one renounces marriage, detaches oneself from the flesh, and by which, thanks to a virginity of heart and body, one recovers the immortality of which one has been deprived. In another passage of the same treatise of virginity, Gregory makes of the parable of the lost drachma the model of concern with oneself. For a lost drachma, you must light a lamp, turn the whole house over, search in every corner, until, gleaming in the shadows, you see the coin's metal. In the same way, in order to recover the effigy which God has printed in our soul and which the body has tarnished, one must take care of oneself, light the lamp of reason, and search every corner of the soul. Between those two extreme points of reference, Socrates and Gregory of Nyssa, one can state that the concern with oneself constituted not only a constant principle, but a very large practice. Amongst those philosophers who claim to be advisors on life and guides on existence, the principle of occupying oneself with oneself was almost universally accepted. Following their master, the Epicureans repeat that it is never too early and never too late to occupy oneself with one's soul. Musonius Rufus, from amongst the Stoics, says also, it is in constantly paying attention to oneself that one assures one's salvation. Or Seneca, you must attend to your soul, attend to yourself, lose no time doing so. Retire into yourself and stay there. Dio of Prusa gives one lecture over to the necessity of an eis eoton anachoresis, a retreat into oneself. And Galen, recalling how much time it is necessary to train a doctor, an orator, or a grammatician, thinks that even more time is necessary to become a good man. Years and years, he says, spent in occupying yourself with yourself. Epictetus, in one of his diatribae, gives this definition of human being. Man is this unique kind of beings on the earth who have to take care of themselves. Nature has provided animals with everything they need. Humans don't have the same natural equipment, but we must understand that the necessity of taking care of ourselves is also a supplementary gift which has been bestowed. God has confided us to ourselves, giving us by this means the possibility and the duty of being free. For Epictetus, the epimeleia heotu, which is ontologically linked to human finitude, is the practical form of freedom. And it is by taking care of himself that human being becomes similar to God, God who has nothing else to do than taking care of himself. For us now, the notion of epimeleia heotu is faded and obscure. It seems to have been covered over either by the Socratic precept gnoti seoton or by the Christian principles of asceticism, which implies renouncing to oneself, to that extent that if we are asked what was the most important moral principle and the most characteristic in ancient philosophy, the answer which comes immediately to mind is not epimele seoto, take care of yourself, but, as you know, gnoti seoton, know yourself. Perhaps our philosophical and historical tradition has somehow overrated the importance of the gnoti seoton, of the know yourself. One must remember that the rule of having to know oneself was, in fact, and in the ancient culture, constantly associated with that of concerning oneself with oneself. And more than that, to know oneself was considered as a means for taking care of oneself. And when we consider Christian asceticism, we are used to underscore the rule of renouncing oneself, and we forget that in the spiritual experience of some early Christians like Gregory of Nyssa, renouncing oneself was a way of taking care of oneself, or at least a new form of the old philosophical epimeleia eotu. And I think that we have to be aware that those two great figures of the Western experience of the self-knowledge and asceticism, those two great figures are rooted in this multi-secular tradition of the care of the self being at the same time in the Greco-Roman culture a notion, a precept, an attitude and a technique, a practical matrix for the experience of the self. Most of the historians of ancient philosophy are concerned with the rise of ontology and metaphysics from Parmenides to Aristoteles through Plato. Most of the historians of Greek sciences are interested in the rise of rational thought through mathematics and cosmology. I think it could be valuable to study also the rise of a certain type of subjectivity, of a certain type of relation to oneself in this Greco-Latin culture of the self. Greek metaphysics has been determinant for our philosophical relationship to being. Greek science has been determinant for our rational relationship to the world. The Greco-Roman culture of the self has been, I think, determinant for our ethical relationship to ourselves. And my dream would be, if I could find people interested in the same topics, to start an historical analysis of those techniques of the self in the Western societies from the beginning of the Greek civilization. My intention tonight is to present you a very brief survey of some aspects of this culture of the self in the Greek and in the Greco-Roman civilization. And I'll take only two views on this culture of the self, one in the 4th century before Christ, and the other on the 2 first centuries of our era. It has been sometimes said that the culture of the self in the Greco-Roman society was linked to the decay of the old political and social structures, the decline of the cities, the decline of the old and traditional aristocracies, the development of autocratic regimes, the increasing importance of private life could have been factors for the rise of a so-called individualism. But my hypothesis is that those historical processes, if they really took place, may have produced some changes in the culture of the self, but they are not, by themselves, the reason for the high value attributed to the care of the self. And this care of the self is very well known and very highly valued since at least the 4th century before Christ. For instance, following at least Plutarch, a king of Sparta, when he was asked by someone why Spartans did not cultivate their land by themselves, but let the ilots do the job for them, this king of Sparta gave this answer: the reason why we do not cultivate our land is that we prefer to take care of ourselves. And in Xenophon, in the Cyropaedia, we see Cyrus, a model of a great king and a good man, following Xenophon. We see Cyrus coming back in his palace after several great victories and conquests, and he meets his old friends and companions and asks them, well, what shall we do now? And Cyrus himself gives the answer. The answer is not, well, I'll take care or will take care of the new empire, he says, and now that we have won victory, we have to take care of ourselves. The culture of the self is not a late phenomenon due to the decline of the classical city. It was an early phenomenon, and it took in the antiquity several forms. The first philosophical elaboration of the principle you must concern with yourself is found in a dialogue written by Plato in the Alcibiades. The Neoplatonists considered that this dialogue had to be the first in the collection of Plato's works. Albinus, a Neoplatonist of the 2nd century after death, said that every naturally gifted young man who has reached the age of philosophizing and practicing virtue should begin by studying the Alcibiades. And Proclus considered this dialogue as the arche apaces philosophias, means the principle and point of departure for all philosophy, because this dialogue teaches people to get concerned with